The moment my husband told me to pick between bending the knee to his toxic family or walking out the front door empty-handed, a chilling calm washed over me because he fundamentally miscalculated who I was. I stood in the middle of a packed backyard patio during a scorching summer Sunday celebration, surrounded by 30 shouting relatives, deafening music, and years of bottled-up resentment that had finally boiled over. His mother stood beside him with her arms tightly crossed, looking at me like I was a stain on her pristine concrete, while his sister smirked behind a plastic cup filled with wine. My name is Clara, and I was 35 years old when my husband, Julian, backed me into a corner with a choice he assumed I would never have the spine to accept. We had been married for 8 years, sharing a quiet, affectionate 4-year-old son named Leo, but my entire existence had devolved into an exhausting exercise in appeasing people who viewed my boundaries as a personal insult. Julian wasn't a villain in the traditional sense. He held down a steady job as a structural engineer, mowed the lawn every Saturday, and adored our little boy. Yet the moment his family entered the equation, a psychological switch flipped inside him, transforming him from my partner into their fiercely loyal foot soldier who demanded absolute conformity. His mother, Eleanor, treated criticism like an art form, dissecting everything from my career choices and my homemaking skills to the exact way I disciplined Leo. In the early days of our marriage, I swallowed my pride, believing that patience would eventually earn their respect. But as the years dragged on, Julian's standard defense whenever I tried to express my hurt was a dismissive shrug and a lazy phrase. "That's just how my mother is. You need to grow thicker skin." The family gathering that detonated our marriage started out like every other miserable Sunday ritual under the guise of celebration. Dozens of aunts, uncles, and cousins filled Eleanor's expansive backyard, creating an overwhelming wall of noise and suffocating heat. Leo was sitting quietly on a folding chair next to me, happily peeling a small mandarin orange I had packed for him, when Eleanor suddenly materialized over our shoulders like a dark cloud. She stared down at his snack container and sneered with a loud, theatrical sigh. "Are you still keeping him on that bizarre organic restriction?" she asked, pitching her voice just loud enough for the neighboring groups to hear. I offered a tight, polite smile, knowing full well that Leo's pediatrician had recommended a strict diet due to recurring mild stomach inflammation, but she immediately rolled her eyes. "It's completely unnatural," she scoffed, drawing the attention of several nearby cousins who immediately stopped talking to eavesdrop. I felt the familiar heat rise up my neck, but I forced my tone to remain level. "I'm just following his doctor's direct orders," I replied softly, hoping to diffuse the exchange before it escalated. Before I could even draw another breath, Julian's older sister, Natalie, inserted herself into the ring with a condescending chuckle. "Oh, please," Natalie mocked loudly. Clara reads one sensationalized article online and suddenly fancies herself a board-certified pediatrician. A ripple of uncomfortable laughter echoed through the surrounding relatives, and my cheeks burned with utter humiliation. Under normal circumstances, I would have swallowed the bitter pill and kept the peace for Julian's sake. But tonight something inside my soul simply snapped, perhaps because I glanced down and saw Leo watching me with wide, confused eyes. "I don't think following medical guidance for my son's health is something worth mocking," I said, my voice cutting cleanly through the ambient noise of the party. The backyard conversation plummeted into an abrupt, stunned silence. Natalie's face flushed a deep, mottled red, and Eleanor instantly folded her arms tighter across her chest, like a general preparing for war. "There you go again," Eleanor hissed, shaking her head in deep disappointment. "There I go what?" I asked, my patience finally wearing completely thin. "Being utterly disrespectful to your elders," Eleanor declared, throwing her hands up in the air. That single word, disrespectful, hit me like a physical blow, branding me a villain simply because I dared to defend my child's health. Within seconds, the surrounding relatives swarmed into the fray like a pack of wolves smelling blood. turning a minor disagreement about a piece of fruit into a full-scale character assassination where every past grievance, real or imagined, was thrown in my face. I looked desperately across the patio toward Julian, praying, begging with my eyes for him to step forward and shut down the madness with a single sentence. Enough, everyone back off. Instead, he remained glued to his lawn chair, staring down at his drink with a look of profound embarrassment, effectively choosing cowardice over his own wife. Then Natalie delivered the final, venomous stroke, loudly complaining about how I ruined every single family function with my miserable, dramatic attitude. That was the exact second I stopped defending myself and started telling an uncomfortable, unfiltered truth about years of coordinated psychological wear and tear, detailing how Eleanor's constant barbed remarks and Julian's spineless complicity had poisoned our marriage. The reaction from the crowd was instantaneous and volcanic, with multiple relatives shouting over one another, demanding that I shut my mouth and apologize immediately. Julian finally hauled his heavy frame out of the chair, his face contorted with frustrated rage as he marched over and barked, "Clara, shut up right now." I stared straight into his eyes, my voice dropping to a dangerous whisper. "No." The entire backyard froze as if time itself had stopped. Julian looked trapped, cornered, and deeply furious that I had publicly stripped away his illusion of domestic control. That was when he delivered his ultimate ultimatum, pointing a trembling finger toward the driveway gate. "Apologize to my mother right now, or you can pack your bags and get out of my life." For a long, suffocating moment, nobody moved or breathed. I looked around the circle of triumphant faces, realizing they all expected my usual pattern of submission, my quick surrender to save the peace. Instead, I turned on my heel, walked inside the cool, quiet house, gathered Leo's favorite blanket and toys, strapped him into his car seat, and drove away without shedding a single tear. Later that evening, after tucking a sleeping Leo into the spare bed at a local extended stay motel, I sat in the dim light of the kitchenette and replayed every agonizing moment of the day, finally seeing the terrifying architecture of my entire marriage with absolute clarity. The true crisis wasn't a petty argument over an orange slice. The true crisis was 6 years of systemic conditioning where my voice, my boundaries, and my dignity were systematically sacrificed on the altar of family comfort. Around midnight, as the neon lights flickered outside the window, a long dormant memory flared up in my mind. 3 years prior, an old college roommate named Veronica, who had successfully launched an upscale boutique marketing firm in Vancouver, Canada, reached out after seeing our wedding photos online and offered me a remote senior project management position with an open-ended invitation to relocate if I ever wanted a fresh start. At the time, I politely declined because Julian refused to leave our hometown, anchoring me to a life that slowly suffocated my ambitions. With trembling hands, I opened my laptop at 2 a.m. and typed out a tentative email to Veronica, explaining that my circumstances had radically changed and asking if the opportunity was still remotely on the table. To my absolute shock, her reply landed in my inbox before I even finished my morning coffee. The firm was expanding into international accounts. They were desperately understaffed, and she wanted me to step into a leadership role immediately with a salary that would easily allow me to support Leo and myself independently. Over the next 72 hours, fueled by adrenaline and a fierce maternal instinct, I handled the administrative chess match of my life, conducting late-night video interviews with Veronica's executive board, accepting a formal contract, securing temporary corporate housing across the border, and quietly researching international transfer protocols for Leo's schooling. Every single decision I made was filtered through a single, ruthless metric. Would this choice build a secure, peaceful, and emotionally healthy environment for my son? If the answer was yes, I executed it with absolute precision. If the answer was no, I discarded it instantly. During those tense 2 weeks of secret preparation, Julian behaved precisely as my psychological blueprint predicted, operating under the deeply entrenched arrogance that I would eventually crack, crawl back, and offer a tearful apology to his mother. In the first few days, he sent short, patronizing text messages designed to test my resolve, such as, "Ready to talk yet?" and "We need to put this behind us. Mom is waiting for an apology." The sheer audacity of that last message nearly made me laugh out loud in the middle of a grocery store aisle, because nobody in his orbit gave a single thought to the emotional wreckage inflicted upon me, fixating exclusively on Eleanor's wounded pride. Eleanor herself called my phone 12 times a day, leaving passive-aggressive voicemails about family unity, while Natalie sent unsolicited Bible verses about a wife's submission. I simply silenced my notifications, blocking their numbers one by one, because I finally understood a liberating truth. People cannot manipulate your narrative or twist your words when you completely starve them of conversation. By the end of the second week, my logistics were completely ironed out. Visas approved, bank accounts restructured, remote contracts signed, and 2 one-way airline tickets secured for a Tuesday morning departure, while Julian was locked into an all-day regional engineering seminar out of town. The night before our flight, Julian came home carrying a heavy takeout bag from my favorite local Italian bistro, wearing a warm, practiced smile that he used whenever he wanted to smooth over a conflict without actually doing the hard emotional labor. We sat across from each other at the kitchen island while Leo slept peacefully upstairs, and Julian poured 2 glasses of wine, looking entirely pleased with his own domestic strategy. "I think we've punished each other long enough over a silly misunderstanding," he said smoothly, reaching across the counter to touch my hand. I looked down at his fingers, feeling an overwhelming wave of cold detachment rather than anger. "I agree," I replied quietly. His smile widened into an expression of triumphant relief, clearly believing his stubborn endurance had successfully worn me down. "I knew you'd come to your senses once you cooled off," he murmured, raising his glass in a silent toast. For a fleeting second, I almost felt a pang of pity for him, knowing the seismic shock wave that was about to hit his comfortable, sheltered world, but I quickly locked that empathy away. The following morning, long before the sun crested over the horizon, I gently woke Leo, dressed him in warm travel clothes, loaded our 2 heavy suitcases into the trunk of my car, and left a neatly folded letter resting squarely in the center of the kitchen island. The letter was entirely free of theatrical melodrama, emotional screaming, or petty insults. It was a cold, clinical document outlining why our marriage had structurally collapsed, why I refused to let my son grow up believing that emotional abuse and forced submission were normal components of family life, and where legal correspondence could be directed moving forward. Exactly halfway through airport security, as I was placing our carry-on bins onto the conveyor belt, my cell phone began vibrating uncontrollably in my pocket, turning into a digital emergency siren as dozens of missed calls, frantic text messages, and panicked voicemails flooded in all at once. Julian had returned from his seminar, discovered the empty closets, read the letter, and completely lost his grip on reality. I ignored every single notification, stepping onto the boarding bridge with Leo holding tightly to my index finger, and did not look back once until we were safely settled into our row on the aircraft. 3 hours later, as the plane leveled out above a thick blanket of endless white clouds, and Leo fell fast asleep with his head resting comfortably against my shoulder, I finally unlocked my phone and dialed Julian's direct line. He picked up on the very first ring, his voice cracking with a terrifying mixture of blind panic, disbelief, and sputtering rage. "Clara, where in God's name are you?" he screamed into the receiver, the background noise of our empty house echoing through the speaker. "You're actually getting on a plane? This is completely insane." I turned my face toward the window, watching the brilliant afternoon sunlight glinting off the aircraft wing, and spoke with absolute terrifying calm. "No, Julian. What's insane is spending the next 20 years of my life apologizing for demanding basic human respect." Silence descended on the other end of the line, heavy and suffocating. And for the very first time since the day I met him, my husband was entirely devoid of a rehearsed argument or a defensive excuse. The initial months of our new life in Vancouver were far from a cinematic fairy tale, because building an entirely independent existence from absolute scratch requires a staggering amount of grit, sleepless nights, and financial discipline. Yet amidst the daily exhaustion of managing a demanding corporate job, while single parenting in an unfamiliar city, something truly remarkable began to unfold right before my eyes. Leo completely blossomed. The chronic stomach aches that had plagued him for months vanished entirely, his nervous tics disappeared, and he transformed into a joyful, confident, and remarkably relaxed little boy who loved his new neighborhood school. The enforced geographical distance acted like a magnifying glass for Julian, forcing him to finally confront the toxic family dynamics and enabling codependency he had aggressively defended and ignored for nearly a decade. Stripped of his mother's daily validation and Natalie's constant poisoning of the well, Julian was forced to sit in the quiet wreckage of his own choices, looking at his life through an unfiltered lens for the very first time. 6 months after our departure, an unexpected email landed in my inbox. Not a furious legal demand or a manipulative guilt trip, but a long, deeply reflective message from Julian. It wasn't just a polished apology for the disaster at the barbecue. It was a raw, unfiltered acknowledgement of his profound failures as a husband, admitting that he had systematically prioritized his mother's fragile ego over his own wife's emotional safety. Eleanor and Natalie attempted their own clumsy, indirect reconciliation maneuvers much later, but by that point, their opinions carried zero currency in my world, because I had built a fortress of self-worth that their toxicity could no longer penetrate. Today, Julian and I share a respectful, highly structured co-parenting dynamic, and while we ultimately chose formal separation rather than attempting to resurrect a broken foundation, he is fundamentally transformed into a much more accountable father to our son. Looking back at the chaotic wreckage of that Sunday afternoon, I realized that the most important element of my survival wasn't the plane ticket, the new career, or the international border separating us from our past. It was the terrifying, liberating realization that true self-respect is never something you beg, plead, or negotiate for from people who profit from your silence. It is something you aggressively claim for yourself. The exact moment my husband told me to apologize or walk out that door, he genuinely believed he was administering a harsh punishment to break my spirit, completely blind to the fact that he was handing me the key to my ultimate freedom, and choosing myself changed the trajectory of our universe forever.